My husband took everything after the divorce. I had one dress left, and a ring my mom gave me before she died. The divorce papers still smelled like his cologne when I signed them. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I stood in that empty apartment on East 74th Street, clutching the only dress I owned. The fabric felt thin between my fingers, like everything else in my life had become. Through the cracked window, I could hear the familiar sounds of Manhattan rushing by: car horns, sirens, the distant rumble of the subway. But inside this hollow space, silence pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. The apartment smelled of fresh paint trying to cover old wounds. Beige walls stared back at me, empty as my bank account, empty as the promises he'd made 43 years ago when we were young and I believed in forever. My reflection caught in the bathroom mirror showed a woman I barely recognized. Gray hair that used to shine, eyes that once sparkled with dreams now clouded with exhaustion. That Tuesday morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through windows that no longer belonged to me. I reached for my phone, hoping for something, anything, from my children. Instead, I found a text from my daughter Rebecca canceling our weekly call. Again. No explanation, just 3 words. Can't talk today. My chest tightened. This was the 4th time in 6 weeks. I set the phone down on the small table I'd bought at the Salvation Army, next to the single chair that now constituted my entire dining room set. The silence that followed felt different from the quiet I'd grown accustomed to. This silence screamed. I closed my eyes and let my mind drift back to our old house in Westchester, the kitchen where I'd made thousands of meals, the living room where Christmas mornings unfolded in wrapping paper and laughter, the garden where I'd grown roses that bloomed every spring like clockwork. Gone. All of it gone. But the worst part wasn't losing the house or the furniture or even the investments we'd built together. The worst part was realizing I'd lost myself somewhere along the way, buried under decades of saying yes when I should have said no, of giving until I had nothing left to give. My mother's ring caught the morning light as I traced its edges with my thumb. She'd given it to me 3 days before she died, pressing it into my palm with hands that shook but eyes that burned with purpose. "This represents your strength, Helen," she'd whispered. "Never forget who you are." For 43 years I'd forgotten. Let me take you back to where it all began. To understand how I ended up here, you need to know the woman I used to be. The woman who walked down the aisle in 1979 wearing my grandmother's pearls and carrying dreams bigger than the city itself. Richard swept me off my feet the way men did in those days. Tall, confident, with a Wall Street job that promised security and a future bright as the Manhattan skyline. He talked about building an empire together, about the fortune we'd accumulate through smart investments in the stock market. He painted pictures of wealth in dollars that would stretch for generations. I was 22 and working at a small accounting firm in Midtown. My parents had taught me the value of hard work, of saving every penny, of building something solid and real. When Richard proposed with a diamond ring that sparkled like my mother's eyes when she was proud of me, I said yes without hesitation. Our first apartment was a tiny studio in Murray Hill. We'd lie in bed and plan our future, the house we'd buy, the children we'd raise, the investments that would secure our retirement. Richard was brilliant with money, already talking about diversifying our portfolio, about how the stock market would be our ticket to millions. "We'll be multimillionaires by 50, he'd say, pulling me close. "You'll see." I believed him. I believed everything he told me. The children came quickly. Rebecca first, then Michael 2 years later. I remember holding each of them for the first time, feeling my heart expand in ways I never knew possible. Richard was working longer hours, climbing the corporate ladder, building what he called our family's financial empire. I quit my job to raise the children. It made sense then. Richard's income was growing, his bonuses substantial. He handled all our investments, managed our growing assets, made decisions about our fortune that was accumulating in stocks and bonds, and later, as technology evolved, even in cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. Those early years blur together now, a montage of sleepless nights, birthday parties, school plays, and holiday mornings. I threw myself into motherhood with the same intensity I'd once brought to my career. Every soccer game, every parent-teacher conference, every skinned knee and broken heart, I was there. Richard's parents moved in with us when the children were 10 and 8. His father had suffered a stroke, and his mother couldn't manage alone. The house in Westchester was big enough, Richard said. We could afford it, thanks to his shrewd investments and our growing net worth. I became 3 people: mother, daughter-in-law, and wife. I managed medications, doctor appointments, and physical therapy sessions. I cooked meals that met dietary restrictions and cleaned up messes that seemed endless. At night, I'd collapse into bed exhausted while Richard worked on his laptop, analyzing stock reports and tracking our investments. "You're amazing," he'd say without looking up from his screen. "I don't know how you do it all." Those words should have felt like praise. Instead, they felt like a job description. The years passed like pages in a book I was too busy to read. Rebecca graduated high school, then college. Michael followed the same path. Both children moved to California for work. Drawn by opportunities Richard's stock market success had funded through trust funds and education accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Richard's parents passed away within 6 months of each other when I was 51. I planned both funerals, managed both estates, and comforted Richard through his grief while swallowing my own exhaustion. The house felt different after they were gone. Bigger somehow, but also smaller. Just Richard and me, rattling around in rooms full of memories. That's when I started noticing the changes. Subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Richard began working even later, traveling more frequently. Business trips to Chicago, Los Angeles, London. The stock market demanded constant attention, he explained. Our portfolio had grown complex, investments in multiple sectors, international holdings, even some experimental positions in cryptocurrency that required round-the-clock monitoring. "Trust me," he'd say when I asked questions about our finances. "I'm building us an empire. We're worth millions now, Helen. Millions." I trusted him. I'd been trusting him for 30 years. But trust began to crack when I realized how little I knew about our actual financial situation. Richard handled everything: the investments, the bank accounts, the insurance policies. I had credit cards and a small checking account for household expenses. But the real money, the serious wealth he'd accumulated in stocks and cryptocurrency, remained entirely under his control. I began to feel like a guest in my own life. The children visited less frequently. Phone calls became shorter. When they did come home, conversations centered around their careers, their relationships, their problems. I listened and advised and cooked their favorite meals, but I started to feel invisible in these interactions. A supporting character in a story where I'd once been the lead. "Mom, you worry too much," Rebecca would say when I expressed concern about seeing them so rarely. "We're busy. You understand." I did understand. But understanding didn't fill the growing emptiness in my chest. Richard's attention drifted too. Conversations at dinner became perfunctory updates about his day, his investments, his concerns about market volatility affecting our assets. He rarely asked about my day, probably because it had become predictably routine. I'd filled the empty nest years with volunteer work, book clubs, yoga classes. I tended the garden, maintained the house, managed our social calendar. But I realized I'd become the background music to his symphony. The first real crack in our marriage appeared on my 58th birthday. I'd suggested we go to that little Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date. Richard said he couldn't. An important client dinner. The stock market was volatile. and several $1 million in investments needed his immediate attention. I spent my birthday alone, eating leftover pasta and watching old movies. Neither of my children called until the next day. "Sorry, Mom," Rebecca said. "I completely forgot. Work's been crazy." Michael sent a text. "Happy belated B-Day. We'll call soon." He didn't call. I began to wonder if this was what the rest of my life would look like. A series of forgotten occasions and postponed conversations, while Richard built his financial empire and our children built their separate lives. The fortune we'd accumulated meant nothing if I had no one to share it with. The warning signs were there. I just didn't want to see them. Richard's business trips became more frequent and longer. Sometimes he'd call, sometimes he wouldn't. His explanations grew vague, his attention more distant even when he was home. He'd spend hours in his study managing our investments, doors closed. Conversations kept private. "The cryptocurrency market never sleeps," he'd explain when I asked why he was working so late. "Bitcoin and other digital assets require constant monitoring. One wrong move and we could lose millions." I accepted these explanations because rejection of them felt too frightening to contemplate. If Richard wasn't who I thought he was, what did that make me? What did that make our life together? The answer came on a Thursday morning in March, exactly 1 year ago. I'd gone to Richard's study looking for our tax documents. He was in Chicago on one of his business trips, and I needed information for our accountant. The study had always been off limits, his private domain, but surely looking for tax papers was reasonable. I found the papers. I also found something else. A bank statement for an account I'd never seen before. An account in Richard's name only, containing assets worth over $2 million. Money from stock sales, cryptocurrency profits, investment dividends. Money I'd never heard mentioned in our household financial discussions. My hands shook as I read through months of statements. This wasn't just hidden money. This was systematic financial deception spanning years. I sat in his leather chair, surrounded by evidence of betrayal, and felt my world tilt sideways. The fortune he'd built wasn't ours. It was his. I was simply the unpaid staff member who'd maintained the home front while he accumulated wealth he had no intention of sharing. That night, I confronted him when he returned from Chicago. "Richard," I said, holding the bank statement, "we need to talk." His face changed when he saw the paper in my hands. Not surprise, recognition. He'd been caught, and we both knew it. "Helen," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd heard increasingly over the years. "You don't understand complex financial strategies. This is just careful asset management." Asset management. My voice came out stronger than I felt. "This is millions of dollars you've never mentioned. Money from our investments that apparently belongs only to you." He sighed like I was a slow student struggling with basic concepts. "It's complicated. The tax implications alone." He waved his hand dismissively. "This is why I handle the finances. You don't have the background to understand these decisions." "I have a degree in accounting, Richard. I'm not stupid." "I never said you were stupid." But the way he looked at me suggested otherwise. "I'm protecting our family's wealth. Everything I do is for us." "If it's for us, why is only your name on the account?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Richard's jaw tightened, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes. "Because I earned it," he said finally. "While you were home playing wife and mother, I was building our assets in the stock market, making the hard decisions about investments and cryptocurrency. This fortune exists because of my work, my knowledge, my risk management." The words hit me like physical blows. Playing wife and mother, as if raising his children and caring for his parents and maintaining his home had been some sort of elaborate game. "I sacrificed my career for this family," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. And I've rewarded that sacrifice with a comfortable life. You've never wanted for anything, Helen. You have credit cards, a nice house, everything you need. What I need is partnership. What I need is honesty. He laughed. Actually laughed. Partnership? You want to be involved in managing millions of dollars in complex investments? You want to handle cryptocurrency transactions and international stock purchases? You couldn't even figure out how to use internet banking until last year. Each word was designed to diminish me, to remind me of my place in his carefully constructed hierarchy. I was the dependent, he was the provider. I was the amateur, he was the expert. I was the wife, he was the owner of everything that mattered. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Richard slept peacefully beside me. I thought about my mother's ring, her words about never forgetting who I was. Somewhere in the past 40 years, I'd let myself become an employee in my own life, accepting wages of comfort and security in exchange for my voice, my independence, my equal place at the table. The next morning, Richard left for another business trip. This one was indefinite, he said. Big opportunities in the cryptocurrency market that required his presence in California for several weeks. He kissed my cheek like always, grabbed his suitcase, and walked out the door. I watched his car disappear down our driveway and realized I felt relieved rather than lonely. That relief should have told me everything. During the 3 weeks Richard was in California, I did something I'd never done before. I hired my own financial advisor. Janet Martinez had been recommended by a friend whose husband had also been secretive about their assets. Janet specialized in helping women understand complex financial situations, particularly in cases where one spouse had controlled all the family wealth. What Janet discovered made the secret bank account look like a minor deception. Richard hadn't just hidden money. He'd restructured our entire financial life to exclude me. The house was in his name only, despite contributions from my inheritance after my parents died. Our investment portfolio, built with money from my former job and my family's assets, was entirely under his control. Even my credit cards were tied to accounts I couldn't access independently. Helen, Janet said gently, you need to understand something. Legally, you have very few rights to assets that are solely in his name. If something happened to your marriage, you could find yourself with almost nothing. But I'm his wife. We built this together. I understand that. But the law looks at documentation, not contributions, and the documentation all says the same thing. Richard owns everything. The room spun around me. Millionaire's wife with no money. That's what I'd become. Janet helped me open my own bank account and transfer money from my household account before Richard could freeze it. She also recommended a divorce attorney, though I wasn't ready to consider that possibility yet. This was still my marriage. Richard was still my husband. Surely we could work through this. Then Richard came home. I tried to approach the conversation differently this time. I explained what I'd learned, how I felt, what I needed to change for our marriage to work. I spoke calmly, rationally, the way I'd practiced with Janet. Richard listened with the patience of someone humoring a child. Helen, he said when I finished, I think you're having some kind of breakdown. All this paranoia about money, hiring attorneys behind my back, questioning decisions I've made to protect our family. Maybe you should talk to someone. A therapist. The gaslighting was so smooth I almost believed him. I'm not having a breakdown, Richard. I'm asking for transparency in our marriage. I'm asking to be treated as an equal partner. Equal partner? He shook his head sadly. Helen, you haven't worked in 20 years. You don't understand business, investments, or asset management. The stock market alone would overwhelm you. And cryptocurrency? Bitcoin and blockchain technology? You can barely operate your smartphone. Then teach me. It's too late for that. These are complex systems worth millions of dollars. I can't risk our entire fortune on your midlife learning curve. The conversation ended the same way our first one had. with Richard dismissing my concerns and me feeling smaller than when we'd started. But something had shifted during those 3 weeks alone. I'd glimpsed what independence might look like, and the image hadn't terrified me the way I'd expected. The final blow came 2 weeks later. I was cleaning Richard's study when I found the legal documents, divorce papers, already prepared, already filed. I was apparently being sued for divorce by my own husband, though he hadn't bothered to tell me yet. The financial settlement he'd proposed was brutal. I would receive minimal support. No claim to retirement accounts or investment assets, no right to the house or the substantial wealth accumulated during our marriage. The Bitcoin and cryptocurrency portfolios, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, weren't even mentioned. According to Richard's lawyer, I deserved essentially nothing. I sat in that study surrounded by evidence of my erasure and felt something break inside me. Not just my heart. That had been breaking gradually for months. Something deeper. The last strand of hope that Richard saw me as anything more than overhead expense. When he came home that evening, I was waiting with the papers. "When were you planning to tell me?" I asked. He glanced at the documents and shrugged. "I was hoping to avoid the drama. Make this as smooth as possible." Smooth. "You're trying to take everything we built together and you want it to be smooth?" Everything? Helen, you didn't build anything. You maintained a house while I built an empire worth millions. You were a good wife, I'll give you that. But let's not pretend you're entitled to assets you played no role in creating. The words cut so deep I felt them in my bones. I raised your children. I cared for your parents. I managed your home for over 40 years. That has no value? It has value. That's why I'm not leaving you destitute. You'll get some money. Enough to start over. Start over. At 62, with no career, no savings, no assets, and no idea how to survive independently after 4 decades of marriage. That night, I called Rebecca and Michael. I needed to hear my children's voices. Needed to know I still mattered to someone in this world. Rebecca's response broke my heart. "Mom, I can't get in the middle of this. Dad says you're being unreasonable about the money stuff. Maybe you should just accept what he's offering. Fighting will only make things messy for everyone." Michael was more direct. "Look, Mom, I love you, but Dad's been planning for retirement for years. He built the wealth. He should get to decide how it's distributed. You'll be fine. You've always been resourceful." Neither of them asked how I felt. Neither offered support. They'd already chosen sides, and I wasn't on the winning team. The divorce moved forward with mechanical efficiency. Richard's lawyers overwhelmed mine with documentation, financial statements, and investment records I'd never seen before. Our assets were indeed substantial. Millions in stocks, cryptocurrency worth hundreds of thousands, real estate investments, and retirement accounts that could have supported us comfortably for life. None of it would be mine. The house sold quickly. Richard moved to a luxury condo in Manhattan, close to his office and his bachelor life. I packed my possessions, amazed by how little remained after 43 years of marriage, and moved to a small apartment in the city. My share of the settlement barely covered the deposit and first year's rent. Standing in that empty apartment, holding my single dress, I realized Richard had achieved something remarkable. He'd managed to make me disappear from my own life so gradually that even I hadn't noticed until it was too late. But you know what? He'd forgotten something important in his careful calculations. He'd left me alive. And being alive meant I still had choices. The first thing I did was call Janet Martinez. "I want to understand everything," I told her. "The stock market, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, all of it. I want to learn what I should have known all along." Janet smiled. "Helen, it's never too late to take control of your financial life." She was right. Within weeks, I was reading financial publications, attending investment seminars, learning about market analysis and asset management. The same mind that had excelled at accounting decades earlier began to grasp concepts Richard had insisted were beyond my comprehension. I wasn't the helpless, naive woman he'd painted me to be. I'd simply been kept in ignorance by someone who benefited from my dependence. My neighbor Marlene had been watching my transformation with interest. She was 74, a widow who'd managed her own investments for 20 years after her husband's death. "You know what your problem was?" she said over coffee in my bare kitchen. "You let him convince you that money was too complicated for your little lady brain. Honey, I've been trading stocks since before that man knew how to tie his shoes. Made myself quite comfortable, too. Marlene became my mentor and, more importantly, my friend. She taught me about researching investments, reading financial statements, understanding market trends. We'd spend hours at her kitchen table, she explaining concepts while I took notes like the serious student I'd become. "The stock market isn't magic," she said. "It's just information and patience, and women are often better at both." Through Marlene, I met other women who'd rebuilt their lives after devastating divorces. Sarah, who'd started a successful consulting business at 65. Marina, who'd discovered a talent for real estate investment and bought 3 rental properties with her divorce settlement. These women hadn't just survived, they'd thrived. "You know what they all have in common?" Marlene asked. "They stopped believing someone else's story about who they were supposed to be." The story Richard had told about me was compelling, helpless, dependent, grateful for scraps. But it was fiction, and I was finally ready to write my own narrative. I started small. With the limited money from my settlement, I opened a brokerage account and began investing in carefully researched stocks. Companies I understood, industries I could analyze. No get-rich-quick schemes or high-risk cryptocurrency plays. Just solid, conservative investments that could grow over time. My first dividend check was small, less than $50. But it represented something profound. Money I'd earned through my own knowledge and decisions. Money that belonged to me alone. As my understanding grew, so did my confidence. I began to see patterns in the market, to recognize opportunities Richard might have pursued with our millions, while I remained ignorant of the process. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was becoming the financially sophisticated woman he'd claimed I could never be. 6 months after the divorce, I received an unexpected call from Rebecca. "Mom," her voice was strained, "I need to ask you something. Did Dad ever mention offshore accounts to you?" My heart raced. Offshore accounts. "The IRS is auditing him. They found some discrepancies in his cryptocurrency reporting. Apparently, there were issues with how he handled some of the Bitcoin transactions, and they're questioning whether all his assets were properly declared." I felt a cold satisfaction mixed with genuine concern. "Rebecca, I never knew about any of his financial dealings. That was the whole problem." "I know, Mom. I know. And I'm sorry I wasn't more supportive during the divorce. I thought Dad was protecting the family money, but now I'm wondering if he was just protecting himself." The conversation lasted 2 hours. Rebecca told me about her father's increasing anxiety, his angry outbursts about government overreach and unfair tax policies. The confident, successful businessman was beginning to crack under scrutiny he'd apparently been avoiding for years. He keeps saying the cryptocurrency regulations are retroactive, that he didn't know he needed to report certain transactions. But Mom, these are millions of dollars in undeclared assets. The penalties alone could be devastating. Part of me felt vindicated. The financial genius who'd dismissed my intelligence was facing consequences I'd been too naive to anticipate. But mostly, I felt sad for the man who'd chosen control over partnership, secrets over trust. A month later, Richard called me directly. "Helen." His voice was different, uncertain, almost pleading. "I need to ask you a favor." "What kind of favor?" "The IRS audit is complicated. They're questioning some joint investments from years ago, things that technically involved both our names even though I managed them. I need you to sign some documents, maybe testify that you weren't involved in the decision-making. The audacity took my breath away. You want me to help you with the tax problems that resulted from hiding assets from me? It's not that simple. These are technical violations, reporting issues. If they pursue this fully, it could affect both our children's trust funds, their inheritance. Please, Helen, for Rebecca and Michael. I sat in my small apartment, looking at the life I'd built from nothing, and felt something settle inside me like peace. Richard, I said quietly, you made a choice 40 years ago to handle everything financial without my input. You made another choice when you divorced me to ensure I had no claim to assets we'd accumulated together. Those were your decisions, made without consulting me. The consequences are also yours. Helen, please. You don't understand the complexity. Stop. My voice was steady, calm. I understand more than you think. I've learned quite a lot about finances in the past year. Enough to know that anyone sophisticated enough to accumulate millions in cryptocurrency should have been sophisticated enough to report it properly. The silence stretched between us like a canyon. I can't help you, Richard. Not because I'm vindictive, but because you spent so many years ensuring I knew nothing about these matters. How could I possibly testify about decisions I was never allowed to participate in? I hung up feeling lighter than I had in decades. The IRS investigation resulted in substantial penalties and forced liquidation of several investments to pay back taxes and interest. Richard's financial empire, built so carefully over decades, shrank dramatically. The man who'd been worth millions found himself scrambling to maintain his lifestyle. Rebecca called with updates, her tone now respectful in a way that had been absent for years. Mom, I owe you an apology. A big one. I never understood what you went through, how Dad treated you. I thought marriage was supposed to be like that. One person in charge of money, the other person just trusting and supporting. I see now how wrong that was. Michael called too, awkward but genuine in his regret. I should have listened when you tried to tell us about the problems. I just assumed Dad knew what he was doing because he was successful. I didn't think about whether he was being fair to you. Their apologies meant something, but they couldn't undo years of feeling invisible in my own family. I accepted their regret while maintaining the boundaries I'd learned to establish. I love you both, I told each of them, but I need our relationships to be different now. Based on mutual respect, not just obligation or guilt. They agreed, somewhat tentatively. Change would take time, but at least we were starting from honesty instead of assumptions. As my second year of independence began, I reflected on the transformation that had taken place. The nervous, uncertain woman who'd signed divorce papers had been replaced by someone I was still getting to know. Someone stronger, more confident, more alive than I'd been in decades. My investment portfolio had grown modestly but steadily. Nothing spectacular. I wasn't trying to get rich quick or compete with Richard's previous success. But the money was mine, earned through my own research and decisions, and it represented security I controlled. More importantly, I'd discovered interests and talents I'd forgotten I possessed. The accounting skills that had been dormant for 40 years had evolved into a genuine aptitude for financial analysis. I'd started a small consulting practice, helping other women understand their financial situations and plan for independence. You should see yourself now compared to a year ago, Marlene observed over dinner at a restaurant I'd chosen and paid for with my own credit card. You carry yourself differently. You speak up in conversations. You make decisions without asking permission from anyone. She was right. The woman who'd once deferred to Richard's opinions about everything now had her own views on politics, investments, travel plans, and life choices. The woman who'd accepted scraps of attention from her children now expected respectful communication, and received it. The ring my mother had given me felt different on my finger now. Not just a sentimental keepsake, but a tangible reminder of the strength she'd recognized in me before I'd found it myself. I'd started planning a trip to Europe, something I'd dreamed of for years but never pursued because Richard preferred domestic travel and controlled our vacation budget. Now I researched destinations, compared prices, and booked reservations without consulting anyone. The freedom was intoxicating. One evening, as I sat in my apartment reviewing my investment statements and planning my travel itinerary, I realized something profound had occurred. I wasn't just surviving post-divorce life, I was thriving in ways I never had during marriage. The small apartment that had once seemed like evidence of my failure now felt like proof of my resilience. I'd chosen every piece of furniture, every decoration, every color on the walls. This space reflected my taste, my priorities, my vision of what home should be. When friends asked if I missed being married, I considered the question seriously before answering. I miss the idea of partnership, I would say. But what I had wasn't partnership. It was employment in a job where I never got a performance review, never received a promotion, and couldn't quit. Now I worked for myself, answering to myself, building something entirely my own. The financial knowledge I'd acquired had practical benefits, but it also provided something more valuable: the confidence that comes from understanding your world instead of being mystified by it. When investment advisors talked about market strategies, I could follow their reasoning and ask intelligent questions. When news reports discussed cryptocurrency trends or stock market volatility, I understood the implications for my own small portfolio. Richard had convinced me that these concepts were beyond my comprehension. In reality, they were simply subjects I'd never been allowed to study. 3 months before my 64th birthday, I received news that crystallized everything I'd learned about resilience and renewal. Rebecca called, excitement clear in her voice. "Mom, I have something to tell you. James proposed." James was the man Rebecca had been dating for 2 years. Kind, funny, respectful of her career and independence. I'd met him several times and genuinely liked him. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so happy for you both. We want to have an engagement party next month. And Mom, I want you to help plan it. Not because you're expected to, but because I value your judgment and I want to celebrate with you." The contrast with my own wedding preparations 45 years earlier was stark. Then I'd been the grateful daughter-in-law, accepting whatever role Richard's family assigned me. Now I was being invited to participate as an equal, valued for my perspective rather than my compliance. At the engagement party, held at a lovely restaurant in Brooklyn, I watched Rebecca interact with James and saw something I'd never witnessed in my own marriage: genuine partnership. They discussed decisions together, deferred to each other's expertise in different areas, and supported each other's individual interests and careers. "Your daughter learned from watching you," Marlene whispered during the evening. "She learned what she didn't want in a marriage." The observation hit me with unexpected force. My struggle for independence hadn't just been about me. It had been about modeling a different way of being a woman, a wife, a person. Later that evening, James pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Mrs. Thompson, I wanted to thank you." "Thank me. For what?" "For raising Rebecca to know her own worth. For showing her that she doesn't have to disappear into marriage. For teaching her that partnership means 2 people contributing equally, not one person managing while the other just supports." His words brought tears to my eyes. I don't know that I taught her those things. I think she figured them out despite my example, not because of it. James shook his head. "Rebecca told me about your divorce, about how you rebuilt your life. She said watching you find your strength gave her permission to expect more from relationships. That's a powerful gift." Driving home that night, I reflected on gifts and inheritance. Richard had always talked about leaving the children financial assets: stocks, cryptocurrency, real estate investments. But the most valuable thing I could leave Rebecca wasn't money. It was the example of a woman who refused to remain invisible, who learned new skills at 62, who chose dignity over security. That legacy felt more precious than any portfolio. My European trip took place the following spring. 2 weeks in Italy, traveling alone but never feeling lonely. I stayed in small hotels, ate at local restaurants, visited museums and historic sites I'd dreamed about for decades. In a small cafe in Florence, I sat sketching the view from my table while sipping wine and reviewing the day's adventure. An older Italian woman at the neighboring table smiled and asked in halting English about my drawings. "You are artist?" "No," I started to say, then caught myself. "Actually, yes, I'm learning to be." We talked for an hour about art, travel, and the freedom that comes with age. She told me about her own late-in-life renaissance, learning to paint after her husband's death, starting a small gallery in her village, traveling to places she'd only read about. "When we are young, we think life happens to us," she said as we parted ways. "When we are older, we learn life is what we make happen." Her words stayed with me throughout the remainder of my trip and beyond. Returning to New York, I enrolled in art classes and began seriously developing the sketching hobby I'd rediscovered. My apartment walls, once bare and institutional, filled with my own work. Imperfect but improving, amateur but earnest. The financial consulting practice grew steadily. Word spread among divorced women about the accountant who understood their situation, who could explain complex financial concepts without condescension, who helped them build independence rather than just survive transitions. "You have a gift for this," Janet Martinez told me after I'd successfully helped 3 clients negotiate better divorce settlements. "You understand the emotional component as well as the financial one." Janet was right. Having lived through financial manipulation myself, I could recognize the tactics other women faced. The deliberate complexity, the withholding of information, the gaslighting about their ability to understand complicated concepts. "The money is never actually complicated," I would tell my clients. "What's complicated is the power structure that benefits from your confusion." As my 3rd year of independence began, I took stock of what had changed. Financially, I was stable, but not wealthy. A far cry from the millions Richard had accumulated and largely lost to tax problems. Emotionally, I was stronger than I'd ever been, comfortable with my own company and choosy about the company I kept. Most importantly, I'd learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. Richard's version of togetherness had left me profoundly isolated, cut off from my own thoughts and decisions, dependent on his approval for my sense of worth. True partnership, I now understood, required 2 complete people choosing to share their lives, not one person disappearing into the other's vision of what life should be. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 3 years after I'd found the divorce papers in Richard's study. "Helen, it's Richard. I need to talk to you." His voice sounded older, uncertain in ways I'd never heard before. "What can I do for you, Richard?" "I wanted to apologize. For everything. For how I treated you during our marriage. How I handled the divorce. How I dismissed your concerns about our relationship. You deserved better." The apology hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. "Thank you," I said finally. "I appreciate you saying that. I also wanted you to know that I'm proud of what you've built since the divorce. Rebecca told me about your consulting practice, your investments, your trip to Europe. I always underestimated you, and I was wrong." The admission felt both satisfying and sad. Satisfying because it acknowledged what I'd always known to be true. Sad because it had taken my complete absence from his life for him to recognize my worth. "I hope you're finding happiness, Richard." "I'm trying. It's been harder than I expected being alone. I realize now that you made our life together work in ways I never appreciated." We talked for another few minutes, carefully polite, like distant acquaintances catching up rather than former spouses who'd shared 4 decades of life. When I hung up, I felt something release that I hadn't even realized I'd been holding. Not forgiveness exactly, that would take longer, but a loosening of old anger. A final letting go of the need for his acknowledgement of my value. I'd found my own value. His opinion, positive or negative, no longer had the power to define me. That afternoon, I walked through Central Park, enjoying the autumn colors and the crisp air that made everything feel possible. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Mom, James and I have been talking about the wedding. We'd like you to walk me down the aisle. Not to give me away, I'm not property to be transferred, but to stand with me as I make this choice. What do you think?" I stood in the middle of the park, surrounded by families and couples and people walking dogs and living their lives, and felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Not just for Rebecca's invitation, but for the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I'd felt invisible in my own life. Now, my daughter was asking me to stand beside her as she created a marriage based on the partnership I'd never experienced, but had somehow taught her to expect. I texted back, I would be honored. The wedding took place the following June. As I walked down the aisle with Rebecca, I saw James waiting with an expression of joy mixed with nervous excitement. I saw Rebecca's radiant face, confident in her choice, but aware of the significance of the moment. And I saw something else. Myself, reflected in the stained glass windows of the church, wearing a dress I'd chosen and paid for, jewelry that belonged to me, holding the arm of a daughter who valued my presence and my opinion. The woman who'd once owned nothing but a single dress and her mother's ring had become someone who owned her own life. At the reception, I gave a toast that came from the deepest part of my heart. "Rebecca and James," I said, raising my glass, "I wish you the kind of marriage I never had but always dreamed of. A partnership where you see each other clearly, support each other's growth, and remain two complete people who choose to share one beautiful life." The applause was warm, but what mattered most was the look in Rebecca's eyes. Recognition, respect, and love for the woman I'd become. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Michael approached me. We'd been rebuilding our relationship slowly, carefully, both of us learning to interact as adults rather than as parent and child frozen in old patterns. "Mom," he said, "I owe you something more than an apology. I owe you thanks." "For what?" "For showing me what real strength looks like. For proving that it's never too late to change your life. For teaching me that marriage should be about two people building something together, not one person controlling while the other just endures." His words echoed James's from the year before, and I realized something profound had occurred. My struggle for independence hadn't just changed my life. It had changed my children's understanding of what relationships could be. Driving home that night, I thought about the woman I'd been on the day I'd found those divorce papers. Scared, dependent, convinced she was too old and too inexperienced to build a life alone. That woman had been wrong about almost everything except one crucial truth. She deserved better. The rest, the financial knowledge, the confidence, the independence, the joy, had all grown from that single stubborn conviction. Now, at 65, I was planning my next European trip, considering expanding my consulting practice, sketching daily, and managing a modest but growing investment portfolio. I was dating occasionally, nothing serious, but enjoying the company of men who saw me as an equal rather than a dependent. Most importantly, I was living in my own story rather than playing a supporting role in someone else's. Do you know what the most surprising thing turned out to be? It wasn't learning about the stock market or cryptocurrency or building a business or traveling alone. It wasn't even discovering that I could support myself financially after 40 years of marriage. The most surprising thing was realizing that the woman I became after divorce wasn't someone new. She was someone who'd always existed, waiting patiently beneath decades of other people's expectations and limitations. The ring my mother gave me before she died had always represented strength. I just needed to learn to see it, and myself, clearly. If you're listening to this story and recognizing pieces of your own life, I want you to know something. It's never too late. Not at 50, not at 60, not at 70. It's never too late to stop accepting less than you deserve. to learn new skills, to discover who you are when nobody else is defining you. The hardest part isn't learning to live alone. The hardest part is learning to trust yourself after years of being told your judgment isn't reliable, your capabilities aren't sufficient, your needs aren't important. But once you break through that barrier, once you start making decisions based on your own values and goals rather than fear of disappointing others, something magical happens. You discover that the person you were meant to be was there all along, just waiting for permission to emerge. I gave myself that permission 3 years ago. It was the best investment I ever made. As I sit here now in my apartment that reflects my taste, my values, my choices, surrounded by art I created and financial statements that represent my own decisions, I feel something I never experienced in 43 years of marriage: complete contentment with my own company. I'm not saying marriage is wrong or that partnerships can't work. Rebecca and James prove otherwise. But I am saying that any relationship that requires you to disappear isn't worth preserving. You have value beyond what you provide to others. You have wisdom beyond what others acknowledge. You have strength beyond what you've been allowed to display. The world needs that version of you. More importantly, you need that version of you. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever wondered if you matter beyond what you do for others? Please share your story in the comments. Let's remind each other that it's never too late to write a different ending. But there's something else I haven't told you yet. Something that happened just last month that changed everything about how I see my future. I was walking through Washington Square Park on a crisp November morning, carrying my sketchbook and planning to draw the fountain, when I heard someone call my name. I turned to see a woman about my age, silver-haired and elegant, walking toward me with a warm smile. Helen Thompson, from Mrs. Crawford's accounting class at Hunter College. It took me a moment to place her, but then the recognition hit me like a wave. Linda Chen. We'd been study partners in college, competing good-naturedly for the top grades in our major. She'd been brilliant, ambitious, planning to revolutionize how small businesses managed their finances. "Linda, my goodness, it's been 45 years, she finished, laughing. Give or take a decade. We sat on a bench near the fountain, two old friends catching up on a lifetime. Linda's story amazed me. She'd built a financial consulting firm from nothing, specializing in helping women entrepreneurs access capital and manage growth. Her company now employed over 50 people and had offices in 3 cities. "I never married," she told me when I asked. "Came close a few times, but I was too stubborn to compromise my independence. My work was my husband," I used to joke, though I'm not sure I was really joking. I told her my story, the marriage, the divorce, the rebuilding. As I spoke, I watched her expression change from polite interest to genuine concern to something that looked like excitement. "Helen," she said when I finished, "what you've done in 3 years is remarkable. But more than that, you've proven something I've been thinking about for months." "What's that?" "That there's a huge need for financial advisors who specifically understand the challenges older women face. Not just divorce situations. Women who've been widowed and never managed money. Women whose adult children are trying to control their finances. Women who want to invest but get patronized by traditional advisors." My pulse quickened. This conversation felt significant in ways I couldn't yet name. "I've been thinking about expanding my practice," Linda continued, "but in a different direction. Creating a specialized branch that focuses on financial empowerment for women over 50. The problem is, I need someone who understands these challenges personally, not just professionally." She paused, studying my face. "Would you ever consider leaving New York? There's a position opening up in my Seattle office, senior partner level. You'd develop and run this new division yourself, hiring your own team, setting your own protocols." The offer hung in the air like possibility itself. 3 years ago, such a proposition would have terrified me. The old Helen would have immediately found reasons why she wasn't qualified, why it was too risky, why she should be grateful for her small consulting practice rather than reaching for something bigger. But the woman I'd become felt her heart race with excitement rather than fear. "Tell me more," I said. We talked for 2 hours. Linda painted a vision of an organization that could help thousands of women gain financial literacy and independence. She spoke of partnerships with legal aid societies, workshops at community centers, online resources that could reach women in small towns where such support didn't exist. "Think about it," she said as we prepared to part ways. "But don't think too long. I need someone who can start in January." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, but not with anxiety this time, with anticipation. The old Helen would have made lists of pros and cons, sought approval from her children, worried about what others might think. The new Helen knew what she wanted. I called Linda the next morning. "When do I start?" The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. I had to wrap up my current client obligations, arrange to sublet my apartment, and plan a cross-country move. Each task felt like an adventure rather than a burden. Rebecca and Michael were surprised but supportive when I told them about the position. "Mom," Rebecca said over dinner, "I'm proud of you. 3 years ago, you were afraid to manage your own bank account. Now you're moving across the country to run a division of a major consulting firm." Michael was more practical in his response, offering to help with the logistics of moving and storage. But I could hear the pride in his voice too when he told his friends about his mother's new career. "She's become quite the businesswoman," I overheard him say during a phone call. "Starting over at 65 and doing better than most people half her age." The comment made me smile. Not because of the praise, but because he saw me as a person with accomplishments rather than just his mother who'd been wronged by his father. Even Marlene, my wise neighbor and mentor, was enthusiastic about the change. "You know what this proves," she said as we packed boxes in my apartment. "It proves that reinventing yourself once gives you the courage to do it again. Most people think change gets harder as you age, but I think it gets easier once you realize you can survive it." She was right. The terrifying uncertainty of 3 years ago had been replaced by confident curiosity about what came next. Richard's reaction was more complicated when Rebecca told him about my move. According to her, he seemed genuinely surprised that I was capable of such a dramatic life change. "He said he always thought you were too cautious for big moves like that," Rebecca reported. "I told him he obviously didn't know you very well." The comment stung slightly, not because it came from Richard, but because it reminded me how thoroughly I'd hidden my true self during our marriage. Even from my own family, I'd presented a version of myself that was smaller, safer, less ambitious than the woman I actually was. Never again, I promised myself. The farewell party my consulting clients threw for me was deeply moving. These women, whom I'd helped navigate their own financial challenges, had become friends as well as clients. They understood the significance of my move in ways that others might not. "You taught us that it's never too late to take control of our money," said Patricia, a widow I'd helped invest her insurance settlement. "Now you're showing us it's never too late to take control of our entire lives." At the airport, saying goodbye to the city that had been both the scene of my greatest losses and my most important victories, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Gratitude for what New York had taught me, excitement about what Seattle might bring, and a deep sense of completion about this chapter of my life. The flight itself felt symbolic. I'd booked a first-class seat with miles I'd earned from my European trip, a small luxury that represented my newfound ability to invest in my own comfort without guilt or permission from anyone else. As the plane lifted off from LaGuardia, I looked down at Manhattan spreading below and thought about the woman who'd arrived in that small apartment 3 years earlier, with nothing but a dress and a ring. She'd been broken, but not beaten, starting over but not starting from nothing. She'd had decades of experience, intelligence, and strength she'd simply forgotten how to access. Seattle welcomed me with rain and possibility. Linda met me at the airport, and as we drove through the city, she pointed out landmarks and neighborhoods, already talking about the office space she'd found for the new division and the staff we'd need to hire. "I've been thinking about the name for this branch," she said as we navigated through downtown traffic. "I want something that captures what we're really doing, not just financial advice, but empowerment. What do you think of Second Chapter Financial Solutions?" The name made my chest tighten with emotion. Second chapter. Yes, that's exactly what this was. Not an ending, but a new beginning. Not a consolation prize, but a victory. "Perfect," I said. My first day at the new office was exactly 53 months after I'd signed those divorce papers. I stood in a bright conference room overlooking Elliott Bay, looking at the team Linda had assembled to brainstorm our launch strategy, and felt a sense of belonging I'd never experienced in 43 years of marriage. These people saw me as Helen the business partner, Helen the expert, Helen the leader. Not Helen the difficult ex-wife, or Helen the helpless divorcee, or Helen the woman who should be grateful for whatever scraps life offered her. Just Helen, in full possession of her own capabilities and future. Over the following months, as we built Second Chapter Financial Solutions from concept to reality, I discovered talents I'd never known I possessed. Leadership came naturally to me when I was working toward goals I believed in. Public speaking, once terrifying, became energizing when I was sharing knowledge that could transform other women's lives. The first workshop we hosted, Financial Independence After 50, was designed for 30 participants. We had to turn away twice that many due to demand. Sitting in that room, looking at 60 women who were hungry for the same knowledge and empowerment I'd found, I felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. One participant, a 70-year-old woman whose adult son was trying to control her investment decisions, reminded me so much of myself 3 years earlier. After the workshop, she approached me with tears in her eyes. "I've been letting my son manage my money because he convinced me I was too old to understand modern investing," she said. "But listening to you today, I realize I'm not too old to learn. I'm just too old to keep accepting other people's limitations of what I can do." I thought of my mother's ring, now on my finger in this new life, still representing strength, but in ways my mother probably never imagined when she gave it to me. "You're absolutely right," I told her. "And you know what? 65 is a perfect age to become your own financial expert. You have the patience, the life experience, and the motivation to do it right." She enrolled in our extended education program the next week. 6 months after moving to Seattle, I received a letter that brought my transformation full circle. It was from the State University of Washington, inviting me to speak at their Women's Leadership Conference about late career reinvention and financial empowerment. The invitation letter addressed to Dr. Helen Thompson, they'd mistakenly assumed I had a doctorate based on my professional accomplishments, made me laugh out loud. The woman who'd once felt stupid for not understanding cryptocurrency was now being asked to share expertise with university audiences. I accepted the speaking engagement, though I corrected the title issue. The speech I gave that day became one of the most requested presentations in my repertoire. "I want to tell you about the difference between being educated and being intelligent," I told the audience of graduate students and faculty. "For 40 years, I let someone convince me that because I hadn't kept up with every new investment trend, I wasn't smart enough to manage money. I confused being sheltered with being incapable. Intelligence isn't about knowing everything. It's about knowing you can learn anything. And the beautiful thing about reaching our 60s and 70s is that we finally stop caring what other people think about our learning curves." The standing ovation that followed felt like vindication for every moment of doubt I'd experienced during my journey to independence. Now, as I prepared to celebrate my 67th birthday, my 4th since the divorce, I'm amazed by how rich and full my life has become. I live in a beautiful apartment overlooking Puget Sound, furnished entirely with pieces I've chosen for their beauty and meaning to me. My walls are covered with my own artwork, still amateur, but improving steadily and giving me endless joy. The financial consulting division I run has helped over 2,000 women gain control of their financial lives. We've expanded to include online courses, partnership programs with law firms handling divorce cases, and even a small scholarship fund for women returning to school after major life changes. My personal investment portfolio, managed entirely by me, has grown substantially. Not into millions. I'm not trying to compete with Richard's former wealth, but into a solid foundation that provides security without dependence on anyone else's decisions. More importantly, I've built a network of friendships based on shared interests and mutual respect, rather than geographical proximity or marital obligations. My social life is richer now than it ever was during marriage, filled with people who see and value the real me. I'm dating someone, David, a widowed professor I met at an art gallery opening. Our relationship is everything my marriage wasn't, based on equality, honesty, and genuine enjoyment of each other's company. We maintain separate residences, separate finances, and separate friend groups while choosing to share many of our experiences. The difference between this and my marriage, I told Rebecca during one of our regular phone calls, is that David and I are together because we want to be, not because we have to be or because we're afraid to be alone. That sounds perfect, Mom, she replied. You deserve someone who adds to your life instead of controlling it. Rebecca and James are thriving in their marriage, which continues to model the kind of partnership I never had, but somehow taught them to expect. They're expecting their first child, my first grandchild, next spring, and they've asked me to be intimately involved in the baby's life. We want you to be the grandmother who teaches our kids that it's never too late to chase dreams, James told me. The one who shows them that strength and independence are valuable at any age. Michael has also grown in his understanding of relationships and personal autonomy. He recently ended a long-term relationship that he realized was repeating some of the unhealthy patterns he'd witnessed in his parents' marriage. I kept expecting her to just go along with my decisions about money and our future, he admitted to me during a visit to Seattle. It took me a while to realize I was turning into Dad. That scared me enough to make some changes. He's now in therapy, working to understand how to build partnerships rather than power structures in his relationships. The fact that my son is actively working to avoid repeating his father's mistakes feels like proof that my struggle for independence created positive change beyond just my own life. Even my relationship with Richard has evolved into something resembling mutual respect. We don't speak often, but when we do, usually regarding family events or grandchildren, the conversations are cordial and honest. He's struggled financially since the IRS investigation and has had to significantly downsize his lifestyle. More importantly, he seems to have gained some insight into how his need for control damaged his relationships with everyone in his family. I spent so much time building wealth that I forgot to build connections, he told me during a brief conversation after Rebecca's baby shower. You were smarter than I gave you credit for, about a lot of things. The admission felt less important than it would have 3 years ago. His approval or disapproval no longer has power over my sense of self-worth. We both made mistakes, Richard, I replied. The important thing is that we learned from them. That conversation marked, for me, the final closure of that chapter of my life. Not with forgiveness exactly, but with understanding and the peace that comes from no longer needing anything from someone who hurt you. As I look toward the future, my late 60s, 70s, and beyond, I feel excited rather than anxious about aging. I've learned that getting older doesn't mean becoming less relevant or less capable. It means becoming more selective about where you invest your time and energy, more confident in your own judgment, more willing to take risks, because you understand that the biggest risk is wasting the time you have left. I'm planning to write a book about financial empowerment for women over 50. Several publishers have expressed interest based on the success of our workshops and my speaking engagements. The idea of becoming a published author at 67 fills me with the same excitement I once felt about getting married or becoming a mother. The difference is that this dream belongs entirely to me. I'm also considering going back to school for that doctorate the university mistakenly attributed to me, Not because I need more credentials, but because I'm curious about formal study in areas that interest me now. The woman who was once told she was too old to understand complex investments is thinking about pursuing advanced degrees in economics and women's studies. Why not? What else is retirement for except pursuing the interests you never had time for when you were busy surviving other people's expectations? My consulting practice continues to grow, and I'm training other women to replicate our model in different cities. The demand for financial advisors who understand the unique challenges faced by women over 50 continues to exceed our capacity to meet it. There's something deeply satisfying about building a business that serves a need I once experienced myself. Every client who learns to manage her own investments, every woman who negotiates a better divorce settlement, every widow who discovers she's capable of making her own financial decisions, they all represent victories over the forces that once kept me small and dependent. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my current life is the relationship I've developed with myself. For 43 years, I was focused outward, on Richard's needs, the children's needs, his parents' needs, social expectations, everyone else's definition of who I should be. Now, for the first time in my adult life, I know who I am when nobody else is watching. I know what I like, what I want, what I'm willing to accept, and what I absolutely won't tolerate. I know my own mind, trust my own judgment, and enjoy my own company. The ring my mother gave me now sits alongside other jewelry I've chosen for myself, pieces that reflect my taste, my adventures, my accomplishments, but it still represents something special, the strength that was always there, waiting for me to claim it. Recently, I was going through old photographs, selecting images for a scrapbook I'm creating for my grandchild, when I found a picture of myself from just before the divorce. The woman in that photo looks tired, uncertain, smaller somehow than her actual physical presence. She's standing slightly behind Richard in the frame, as if she's not quite sure she deserves to be fully in the picture. I compared it to a photo David took of me last month at a conference where I was the keynote speaker. In this recent photo, I'm standing at a podium, gesturing confidently while addressing an audience of several hundred people. My posture is straight, my smile is genuine, and my eyes are bright with purpose and joy. The transformation is so complete it's almost hard to believe these are photographs of the same person. But they are. And that gives me hope for every woman who's listening to this story and seeing pieces of her own life reflected in mine. You don't have to accept less than you deserve because you're over 50, or 60, or 70. You don't have to remain invisible in your own life because you've been invisible for years or decades. You don't have to stay trapped in relationships or situations that diminish you just because change feels scary. The woman you were meant to be is still there, waiting for permission to emerge. The skills you think you've lost can be relearned. The dreams you've deferred can still be pursued. The life you want can still be built, even if you're starting from what feels like nothing. I know this because I lived it. At 62, with one dress and a ring, feeling like my life was over, I discovered it was actually just beginning. The best years of my life have been these past 4 years. The years I built for myself, on my own terms, according to my own values and dreams. If I can do it, so can you. If I can learn to manage investments, build a business, move across the country, develop new friendships, and create a life I love at this stage, then you can too. Age is not the limitation we've been told it is. It's simply a different starting point for a new adventure. The question isn't whether you're too old to start over. The question is whether you're brave enough to stop accepting less than you deserve. I found my courage in a mother's ring and a stubborn refusal to disappear. Where will you find yours? Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever wondered if you matter beyond what you do for others? Please share your story in the comments. Let's remind each other that it's never too late to write a different ending.